Next guest wrote a book critiquing pharma giant Johnson & Johnson and the American health system. No More Tears, The Dark Secrets of Johnson & Johnson. Joining us right now on the company's history and its challenges, author Gardiner Harris, a former reporter for the New York Times. We should note, before we even get into this, because we just had the CEO on, Gardiner, that in a statement, spokesperson says that they stand behind the safety of their products and are focused on what they say they do best, delivering medical innovation for patients around the world. A good disclaimer before we get into things. You wrote a very critical, almost blistering book about Johnson & Johnson. How did this start, and what do you think was the biggest takeaway?
Andrew, it's good to see you. You and I worked together for years and years.
Many years ago.
It started actually at an airport, and I talk about that story in the book, meeting a Johnson & Johnson sales rep who told me a terrifying story about the company's products' effects on her nephew. As you know, I covered the drug industry for the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. And what struck me about Johnson & Johnson was, on the one hand, it was by far and away the most admired company in the industry. You know, Johnson & Johnson is part of the Dow Jones Industrial Average. It is one of only 2 companies in the United States that has a AAA credit rating. It routinely tops the surveys of the most admired companies in the world. But in fact, it has authored the largest frauds in American history. You know, when we think about corporate fraud, we think about Enron, Tyco, WorldCom. Those companies do not even hold a candle to Johnson & Johnson in the myriad products that it sold, that it knew not only didn't help people, but in many cases killed them. And in some cases, targeted things like babies. So I felt it was important to bring all these stories together in one place to show just how dark this history is. And I think for the larger corporate world, one of the lessons is be careful about mission statements. Johnson & Johnson really is the first major company with a mission statement. They call it the Credo. And I think it helped to sort of obscure within the company just how bad the behavior had become.
Gardiner, let me just ask you this, though. You just compared this company to WorldCom, you compared it to Tyco, a number of other businesses. In virtually every case that you just mentioned, there were executives that went to jail.
Yes.
That were found to be not just liable, but guilty, criminally so, for misdeeds. That's not the case here. And so I want to be careful, or at least I want to understand your thinking in terms of describing it that way.
Well, first of all, Johnson & Johnson did plead guilty to criminal charges in some of these cases. Prosecutors did not prosecute individual executives. I actually have the grand jury files in many of those cases. As you know, in our business, it's extremely rare to get grand jury files. I was a White House correspondent for the New York Times. We would get national security documents. But as far as I know, the New York Times and CNBC haven't gotten a single grand jury file in 40 years. You know, I have hundreds of them. And it shows that prosecutors discussed prosecuting executives, but just decided it would be too hard. The remarkable thing about Johnson & Johnson's story is how really they got away with it for so many years across so many products. I estimate that the company is responsible for roughly 2 million deaths. You know, even on opioids, for instance, the story that we've all been told is that it was Purdue Pharma and the Sacklers that were responsible for the opioid crisis. That's simply not true. Around 20% of the bodies that showed up in morgues during the prescription opioid crisis had a Purdue Pharma product in their system. 60% had a J&J product in their system. You just had a deal about Bristol Myers and BioNTech on a cancer drug. Johnson & Johnson sold the most popular cancer drug in the United States in the 1990s and 2000s.
I want to either talk in specific. I'm a little worried that we're talking in a very broad generalities. Sure. I want to either talk in specifics if we could, but more importantly, I want to ask you a different question. And it seems to me the great complication of the universe of medicine, which is that there are oftentimes, unfortunately, drugs that do damage to people, but oftentimes, hopefully, do a lot more good in terms of saving people. And so there's this very unique balancing act where, you don't want to hurt anybody, but at the same time, you want to help the most people you can. And my question, it maybe goes to a very sort of philosophical one, which is, do you believe that ultimately the individuals either who are running J&J today or running J&J in the past are good people, meaning that they understood and had good intention, but also recognized that there was this balance and that they made a trade-off, or something else?
I think it was something else. And I think that is the story, for instance, that everyone accepts about the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. It's a story that people have a hard time accepting about J&J because it has this patina of credibility. I mean, they knowingly sold Johnson's baby powder, even though they knew that it was contaminated with asbestos for decades. They sold a cancer drug that they knew caused cancer tumors to grow. It was the most popular cancer drug in the United States. I estimate that it costs roughly 500,000 people their lives. You're right, Andrew, that medicine is one of those things where you are constantly balancing risks and benefits. In too many of these cases, Johnson & Johnson knew that there was not a single benefit to the drug, to the patient, but that there was significant risks. There was a heartburn drug called Propulsid. They tested it 20 separate clinical trials in babies because they wanted to sell it for babies. It never showed a benefit. They nonetheless underwrote a quiet marketing campaign in babies, and it caused this heart arrhythmia in babies. They knew about this and yet continued to sell it, and dead babies continued to pile up. So again and again and again, this company knowingly sold products that it knew not only didn't benefit patients, but actually hurt them and in many cases killed them. That's how you get to 2 million deaths.
Gardner, I know that talc itself, it's still, I mean, it has a similar structure to carcinogens, but I don't know if it's actually classified as a carcinogen. Now, talc contaminated with asbestos is absolutely a carcinogen. So that was, how much contamination? I stopped using it long ago and went to corn power, whatever the heck it is. And I don't use anything anymore. I've given up. It does make things run, it's just smooth and nice, feels good.
Sure.
And talc feels even better. Yeah. But so there were, why is it, when you're actually, what do you do, mine? Where do you get the talc, and why was asbestos, and how much contamination was there? That's a stated... That actually did happen with all of the J&J baby powder products? Because I was worried about just the talc itself and its structure.
In a meeting that I thought deserved a lot more attention, the FDA commissioner just last week held an advisory committee hearing where he declared openly and forcefully that talc is a carcinogen. Okay. And that talc is a carcinogen largely because you cannot get rid of the asbestos. So talc, as you said, talc and asbestos are chemically identical. So it's just a matter of pressure and time as to whether those constituents create talc or create asbestos. So there is not an asbestos mine in the world that doesn't have a little bit of a talc in it. And there's not a talc mine in the world that doesn't have a little bit of asbestos in it. You cannot get rid of it entirely. And, there are hundreds and hundreds of documents that have finally come to light recently showing that Johnson & Johnson knew about this from the 1950s onward. Now, it was small amounts. And I think certainly during the 50s and 60s, when there was a lot of asbestos in American society, they kind of said, this is not that big of a deal. But the reason really started to show that even microscopic amounts of asbestos could cause cancer.
Yeah, chemically similar, not identical. One makes fibers, the other makes fibrous crystals, the other makes plate-like sheet, but very similar. And they occur naturally because they're silicate minerals, and you can't really mine the talc without having some contamination, apparently, but not identical chemically, although they have similar.
I'm sorry, they have the identical like minerals in them. I mean,
but the structure is different. Yeah, right.
Yeah, but again, this is what the new FDA commissioner said just last week, and the deputy commissioner, that they said unequivocally that talc is carcinogenic. And they want it out not only of powders, but of it's sometimes in drugs as a excipient, makes things go down, as you know, a little bit easier. And so the FDA is now on a campaign to get rid of it from American society. And the question is, as you just said, why not use cornstarch from the 19 Pfizer and Colgate-Palmolive, all these other companies that once used talc transitioned in the 70s and 80s, and Johnson & Johnson just sort of stubbornly kept with it. And that behavior is true across a huge range of products.